In December 1972, as negotiations at the Paris Peace Accords reached a deadlock, the United States administration decided to launch a devastating strike aimed at forcing North Vietnam back to the Stone Age and compelling Hanoi to accept favorable terms at the negotiating table. Operation Linebacker II was officially initiated. The decisive weapon chosen by the Pentagon was the B-52 Stratofortress, known as the Super Flying Fortress. This was not merely a war machine, but a symbol of the absolute power of the United States Air Force at the time. The U.S. military believed that with an operational ceiling exceeding 10,000 meters, beyond the reach of most conventional anti-aircraft artillery, and the ability to carry up to 30 tons of bombs for large-scale carpet bombing, the B-52 was invincible. Moreover, these flying fortresses were protected by a massive electronic warfare system, accompanied by dozens of fighter aircraft flying ahead to deploy electronic countermeasures, turning the radar screens of Vietnam's air defense forces into a harmless sea of white noise. However, the Americans failed to anticipate the iron will and tactical ingenuity of their opponent. On the night of December 18, 1972, as the biting cold of the northern winter blanketed the land, air raid sirens suddenly wailed across the skies of Hanoi. Loudspeakers echoed urgent announcements warning that enemy aircraft were approaching. On the ground, the capital's old quarter descended into a state of controlled panic. Self-defense forces and militia, their faces smeared with mud, shouted themselves hoarse as they rushed through the darkness, herding the last civilians into cramped A-frame shelters. Within minutes, the earth began to tremble violently. Thousands of tons of bombs from invisible B-52s, flying at an altitude of 10 kilometers, poured down like a merciless torrent of steel, flattening homes, hospitals, and residential areas, and tearing apart the night with towering columns of blazing red fire. Blasts of scorching wind lashed against faces, while human cries of anguish were completely swallowed by the relentless, thunderous roar of carpet bombing. At the same time, deep underground inside the stifling SAM-2 missile control cabins, thick with the acrid smell of overheated machinery, a life-and-death battle of intellect and nerves was unfolding between Vietnam's air defense forces and the United States Air Force. Vietnamese radar operators, their foreheads drenched in sweat and eyes bloodshot, were glued to their Vico screens. Just as the U.S. Air Force had intended, the entire radar system had been effectively blinded by active electronic jamming. The screens displayed nothing but chaotic bands of white interference, dancing wildly. Yet hard-earned experience from months of studying the enemy's operational patterns had taught the Vietnamese missile troops a crucial lesson. The larger the aircraft and the tighter the formation, the broader and more structured the interference it produced. Amid the relentless thunder of bombs shaking the bunker's roof, the commander's voice rang out sharply, ordering the entire crew to ignore the random noise and aim directly at the center of the interference mass to track the target. The soldiers' hands moved swiftly over control wheels and dials, their eyes straining to search through the blinding clutter. And then, gradually, a denser, more concentrated streak of light emerged. That was the core of the B-52's jamming signature. The moment the range and targeting parameters fell into the optimal window, the launch command was given, decisive, like a verdict of history. Outside the battlefield, a deafening explosion tore through the air. The entire area lit up in an instant. Massive SAM-2 missiles roared off their launch pads, spewing brilliant streams of flame as they screamed skyward, carrying the fury of the earth straight toward the cloud of interference. High above, inside the cold cockpit of a B-52, the American crew was seized by sheer panic as the warning system suddenly howled uncontrollably. Despite their most advanced electronic countermeasures, they realized they had been locked onto. The cumbersome bomber banked desperately, releasing clouds of metallic chaff in a frantic attempt to evade, but it was too late. A blinding fireball erupted, illuminating the entire night sky. The shock wave rippled through the clouds, tearing apart the once invincible flying fortress of the U.S. Air Force. Burning fragments of the aircraft broke away and fell to the ground like a blazing meteor shower. Inside the Vietnamese command cabin, the massive interference band vanished from the radar screen. The soldiers collapsed onto their consoles, gasping for breath, then embraced one another in overwhelming emotion. The following morning, dawn broke over a scene of devastation, yet filled with defiant pride. Bustling neighborhoods such as Cam Thien had been torn apart, reduced to flattened expanses of rubble, still smoldering with the acrid stench of explosives. Rescue teams and survivors, their hands bloodied, frantically clawed through the wreckage in search of their fellow citizens. Yet interwoven with this overwhelming grief was an unyielding will. In ponds and fields on the outskirts, the charred wreckage of B-52s lay embedded in the mud, silent testimony to the failure of a campaign of coercion through overwhelming firepower. At the air defense positions, Vietnamese soldiers, soaked in sweat and coated in smoke and dust, some still binding bleeding wounds, hurriedly used pulley systems to haul fresh SAM-2 missiles onto their launchers. They looked up at the sky, still streaked with fading trails of gray smoke, fully aware that night would bring the return of the American bats of war seeking retaliation. But the missiles were already in place. This sky, even in the face of the most formidable firepower in the world, would be defended with a spirit ready for sacrifice. That unequal confrontation became one of the most tragic and heroic epics in history, shattering the aura of invincibility of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces and forcing Washington to return to the negotiating table and sign the Paris Peace Accords, bringing a complete end to its military intervention in Vietnam.